so happy we alive.
Broad range of not only marijuana law reform, but broad drug law reform generally. Today we hear from a liberal Democratic congressman from an eastern state who just 3 weeks ago introduced legislation that would repeal federal restrictions prohibiting states from allowing medical use of marijuana. And that is something I have seen firsthand with my late wife, that it works. And in introducing this legislation, Representative Frank was clever enough to put it in terms of being states' rights legislation, which no doubt discomforted a number of his colleagues. When you have a congressman that clever, that wonderful, you want to cherish it. You want to re-elect him. And that is indeed what the voters of the 4th District of Massachusetts have done every year since 1980, when they first elected Representative Barney Frank to Congress. Prior to that, he served in the Massachusetts State Legislature. He was administrative assistant to U.S. Congressman Michael Harrington. He was chief assistant to Mayor Kevin White of Boston. He's a graduate of Harvard College and the Harvard Law School. And according to ABC News, he is one of the best debaters in the House of Representatives in years. I'm glad we don't have to debate him. For those patients who need marijuana to relieve pain and suffering, or for those of us who just want to be left alone by the government on the marijuana issue, on many other issues involving privacy, Representative Barney Frank is a true hero. And we are proud to have him with us at Normal Conference today. Representative Frank.
I was given a very good topic, and I appreciate the structuring by the organizers, and it was to talk a good deal about how to focus your efforts. And I'm glad to do that. I was glad to hear in the last minutes of the previous speech, which I heard, a similar focus. As elections approach, politicians tend increasingly only to tell audiences things which they are sure everyone in the audience fervently believes. That, if you are in a tough race, is often necessary, but it is as boring as hell. So I forbear that. My own view is, other than in your own district very shortly before a tough election, if you are pretty sure everybody who listens to you is going to agree with everything you say, why don't you just go to dinner and save everybody's time? So, obviously, the case for change is overwhelming. Let me just say, with regard to the medical marijuana issue, I think that's a very good model, not just for medical marijuana, but for the whole set of issues about how it ought to be treated legally. That is, I think let me begin by saying, I think one of the things people ought to argue for is the right of each state to set its policy regarding how marijuana is going to be treated. We've always talked about the benefit of the U.S. government as a laboratory. Now, we will run into some problems that you might not expect with conservative. My conservative colleagues, with the rare exceptions like Jerry Johnson, are being hypocritical here, not only in disregarding states' rights, but, as some of you will be aware, conservatism on social issues in America, unlike conservatism in other parts of the world historically, has become very popular, and they appeal to the people. And I have heard over and over again, whether it was the death penalty or affirmative action or similar issues that are socially divisive, that we have a solemn duty to listen to the people. And when the people vote down affirmative action, how dare you try to resurrect it? And if the people are for the death penalty, then of course you should be for the death penalty. And of course, the most glaring example we have in America today of elected officials ignoring the clear, official, formal vote of the people, not polls, not random samples, but the results of open and free elections in which the people go to the polls and register their opinion, The clearest example we have of politicians not listening are my colleagues from the states of Arizona and California and elsewhere who defy the wishes of their voters with regard to medical marijuana. I mean, I don't understand how they... It is literally the most glaring example we have of elected officials simply defying what their voters say. Now, if you want to adumbrate the view that says I have a responsibility to do what's right regardless of what the voters say, okay. The problem is you can't turn that on and off. That is an argument. It's not a water faucet. You can't turn it on when you want it and not when you don't. And in fact, on states' rights, when it comes to protecting people from unfairness in the economic system or providing for a clean environment, both issues where I think you need to have a national policy. You can't have state-by-state environmental rules. State borders may be very impressive, but they don't go much more than 10 or 12 feet in the air. And it's kind of hard to expect state borders to protect you from air pollution. And most rivers tend not to stop at state lines. So if you're going to do those things, you need to do them on a national level. We each compete for industry, so certain basic economic things have to be done at the state level. But there are issues where states could, on their own, formulate policies and have very little effect on other states. On the question of criminal law, on the questions of personal behavior. And paradoxically, it is precisely those issues where, logically, the case is the strongest for leaving state discretion that the conservatives want to nationalize things. Things like assisted suicide, things like medical marijuana, other issues of that sort. In fact, I have figured out, finally, the conservative approach. They offer states' rights on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And they are for nationalizing issues on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. What they do on Sunday, I don't want to know. But clearly, with regard to medical marijuana, as I said, you don't even have to get into the substance. The second point, of course, is to get into the substance. And the notion that elected officials ought to be able to supersede doctors with regard to the prescription of medical marijuana is nonsensical on several levels. There is, of course, no argument, literally no argument, that is used against marijuana as something to be prescribed that does not apply with far greater force to dozens of drugs which can be legally prescribed. I mean, on the scientific level, the argument makes no sense, but we understand that. It is also the case that we treat marijuana in this society, and I should be very clear, I do not advocate people using various mind-altering substances. The less of any of that you do, the better. The less you smoke, and the less you drink, and the less you inhale tobacco, and the less you smoke pot, I think the better off you are. And I think we ought to have a society in which we promote the non-use of all of those things. And certainly there ought to be an age cutoff. But the disparity with which we treat among those three, marijuana compared to alcohol and tobacco, can only be explained by the fact that marijuana has historically been seen by a lot of Americans as a badge of the counterculture. There really is nothing rational in the substance itself. At first it was jazz musicians, especially black ones, who were going to seduce America, and that's when the first anti-marijuana stuff came. Then in the 60s it became a kind of emblem of people who were politically dissatisfied. I must say, because of my job, spent a lot of time working with law enforcement officers whom I respect enormously, and I've never met the cop yet who would rather go in and have to break up a group of beer drinkers than marijuana smokers. I mean, you tell a cop that there's some people out there drinking beer and they've been drinking beer for a couple of hours and he's got to go break it up. He's going to be a lot tenser than if you tell him he's got to go break up a bunch of people who've been smoking marijuana. I mean, it's just... which substance induces more antisocial behavior? It's not a close question. Which substance causes more danger? And I say that because people here can have their own views and have their own views on things. I don't think the advocacy ought to be on the basis of, or needs to be on the basis of, saying this is a good thing. It's not a good thing or bad thing, it's none of the government's business in many cases. And it certainly is less of a bad thing. It's less of a bad thing than a number of other things. But let me give you one other argument. There are two arguments that I think we should be using